Welcome to Exploring Monterey Bay, airing on KSQD 90.7, 89.7, and 89.5 FM. I'm your host, Mathilde Rand. My guest is Margaret Kahn, author of The Children of the Jinn, In Search of the Kurds and Their Country. Her latest book is Familiar Strangers, Stories from America and the Middle East. Her friends call her Margie. She's a linguist, writes plays and fiction, and she is a musician. Welcome, Margie.
Thank you. Thank you, Mathilde. Thank you for having me on again.
I know we were here before with the Children of the Jinn. So let's give people a little background. And when was the first time you had contact with people from the Middle East?
When I was at Columbia University, I knew a lot of Turks, and I was majoring in linguistics, and I decided that I would study Turkish as my non-Indo-European language. So that's when I really started to become more aware of the cultures and languages of the Middle East. Yeah.
Right. And then you went to Iran?
Yeah, I went to Iran sometime after that because I went to grad school at Michigan, and I worked on Arabic a lot, and the head of the department there had worked on Kurdish, and I became fascinated by just everything about the Kurds. I decided I wanted to go and do field work in linguistics. I wanted to be an old-fashioned linguist, and I got a job in teaching in Northwest Iran in agricultural college in order to be able to do my field work.
And that's where you met a number of Kurds?
Yes, first I had to find them. That's why I wrote the story of finding them. And then I conducted my fieldwork, and I also taught English as a second language to agricultural students. Yeah.
Then you came back and you wrote
I came
a book?
back, I finished my degree, and there were not a lot of jobs in linguistics, and I found a job in Alexandria, Egypt, so I went to live in Egypt for a while. And then I went back to spend time with the Kurds in Iran the summer before the Shah fell. And as a result of that, I was able to write Children of the Jinn. Yeah.
Which is, by the way, listeners, a fascinating book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, it's uncommonly truthful, which many people have noted, but it's not an academic book. It's a popular book about my experiences living there.
Right. And so, Familiar Strangers, Stories from America and the Middle East. It's a collection of stories. Now, are they based on your experiences when you lived in the Middle East?
They're sparked by the people I met, and they're not just about people in the Middle East. They're about Middle Easterners in America. But they all have that sort of common thread. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, why not, like the first book, based on your experiences?
Another memoir of my experiences in America meeting refugees. I always wanted to be a fiction writer, but I wrote the story of what happened with the Kurds. I wanted to bring the Kurds to the attention of Americans. And with this book, I had these people that I had met, I had these experiences I had, and I wanted to write more deeply about individuals. And more, in some ways, it frees you up to write fiction. At the time that I wrote that memoir, that was before memoirs became so popular, sort of at the beginning of it. Mm-hmm. And so I really stuck to what happened. I think a lot of later memoirs that people wrote had more fictional elements in them, but mine did not.
Well, because you want to be honest and truthful.
I did, but there's something that you want to have for the story. So sometimes I had an editor who said, I like this part about the sheep smugglers in eastern Turkey. Could you just add a little more to that? And I said, no, that's all that happened.
Right. But you said no more memoirs. And why was that? People want to believe what's true, that it's true, right, in your stories. And they ask you.
Well, that's a good question. And I think fiction is suffering for it. But I think there's a lot of truth in fiction. You can get at deeper truths in fiction, at emotional truths, that you can't as easily in nonfiction.
I hear you say the word emotional truth. Mm-hmm. That's what you're after?
Yeah, that's part of it. The reason why I write is to kind of get inside people, to understand why people made the decisions they do, what their lives are like. And often I'll choose a point of view that's not so close to my own in order to find that out. You use your imagination and your knowledge, your life experience, and your compassion to understand people.
Yeah. Which I think in these days is extremely important. It's very hard for many people to look inside another person's motivation. It's typically pushing away from what they're saying, and what I'm saying is more truthful, because we all want to bring the truth to ourselves, and we don't necessarily know that there's a truth in other people and what they are saying.
Fiction has that ability that film doesn't have, and even fiction has become very visual. I think people are very focused on what's visual, and it's harder to focus on inner voice and what can't be seen.
I remember that you talked about emotional truth, and so I've been thinking about that, and I really appreciate that, because there's a lot of emotions these days in communication, but it's not emotional truth. We're not trying to find out what the truth is behind the emotions from other people.
I'm pleased that you acknowledge that you understand that. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm a little influenced by reading about you, talking with you. Would you like to read a little bit from your book and maybe give an introduction to the first reading?
I'm going to read from the first story in the collection, which is about a woman who's Armenian American. Her mother was a survivor of the genocide that's never been acknowledged by the Turkish government.
That was in like 1914 or something?
Yeah. She is a successful academic, and she has chosen to study Turkic culture. And the Turks were the people that affected that genocide. Actually, Kurds were involved too. It's a terrible story. All these stories are terrible stories. We know these stories. They're happening still. But Anahid is her name. She has an Armenian name, and she's attending a church supper and with her mother. And so I talk about the food they all bring, which is wonderful. Food is an important part of my writing. I always try to describe the food. Here I'll start with, here in the middle of the first story, Understanding the Enemy. Anahid pulled out the metal folding chair. John looked up. So John is the guy that she meets at this church supper. She just runs into him. Your mother really has a lot of interesting stories. People were always telling her that. Sometimes she wondered if these people knew what it would be like to live with those stories, day after day, year after year. The story of how her mother's little brother died on the march. The story of how her mother came across her own mother's corpse floating in the river. When she was still a little girl, her mother had talked about clutching the body, wanting to hold on to any part of her rather than live without her. Anna had thought other children grew up with mothers like this until she went away to college. Other girls' mothers might be crazy and problematic, but they did not tell stories like that, nor did they deliver their genocide stories in a monotone that made them seem even more horrible. There was something dead about her mother. Anna had realized this years ago when she and her mother had had a fight, a big screaming argument. She had run out of the house, tears streaming. She didn't see where she was going until she hit bark. Then she looked up. It was the old elm, the one that was dying. The leaves were so far away. All she could touch was the dead part, the wood. Anna had remembered coming home from school and waving things in her mother's face, incessantly talking of people and events while her mother stood at the sink, working, always working, without showing any interest. After a while, Anna had given up, gone outside, searched for friends to play with anyone whose face was not dead. Anna had studied her now as she spoke to John. She was struck by how animated she was. Her eyes opened wide and then narrowed. She waved her hands around. After a while, Anna had realized it was not a back and forth. Her mother was putting up a screen of words to keep him from getting close. Whatever would keep him at bay. Maybe that's why her mother resented her so much, because Anna had, from her very conception, was too close. Her mother couldn't stand to be too close. Anna had known this from the time she was little. Her mother would turn away from lines or from crowded places, saying they would go another day when it wasn't so busy. Her father said she should try to understand what her mother had been through and forgive her. But Anna had been too young. She could imagine surviving. She was young and strong the way her mother had been. She just couldn't imagine the marks such survival left on a person. Now she understood more. She had read enough about it. She had even gone to those places where her mother's heart had been figuratively cut out of her and lost. "You must be very proud," she suddenly heard John saying, "to have a daughter like Anahid." Anahid looked up from her desserts. Her mother was grimacing. "Oh, yes, well," her mother was saying, as if she wasn't proud at all, but just trying to stop herself from saying something she shouldn't. "Anahid has been lucky." "You know," John leaned forward slightly, almost as if he were about to reveal a secret, "I have a good friend who's a Turk. He loves Armenian cooking. I thought of inviting him here tonight." Anahid's mother raised her eyebrows, or rather her single eyebrow. Anahid felt like laughing. Poor John. He was probably losing every single point he'd built up in her mother's estimation. But he didn't seem aware of that. "My friend isn't like this, but many Turks, even educated ones, still think there was no massacre or the Armenians brought it on themselves." He paused and then went on. "Of course, we know what we Armenians think of Turks. I think it takes a lot of courage to bridge the gap, to try to understand your own enemy."
Very, very powerful.
Oh, thank you.
I've always been struck by, I can't say story, of the interaction between the Turks and the Armenians. And of course, when I was a kid, there was also talking about what happened to the Armenians and that the Turks wouldn't acknowledge it. And didn't they recently, in the last few years, let go a little bit, acknowledge it a little bit?
4 of these stories were actually published in Ararat magazine, which was the national literary magazine, Armenian literary magazine, put out by the Armenian General Benevolent Union. So I have read a lot of literature, a lot of periodicals put out by the AGBU, and very interesting articles too. And there are Armenians still living in Turkey, but they live with a cloud over them, like second-class citizens. The Turkish government has never officially acknowledged the genocide. And that's a big deal if you compare Jews to Armenians. The Jews had their genocide acknowledged, but the Armenians didn't. No reparations, not even an acknowledgement. That's a big deal.
Yeah, so I'm mistaken. I thought that was a little bit of a closure. I mean, not a real apology, but I thought that was maybe some better understanding what Armenians had gone through by the Turks.
I don't really know because I don't live in Turkey. There may be Turks, there may be more understanding in terms of the general public awareness.
Awareness is very important, and we're looking for it in these times as well. So let me tell our audience that they are listening to Exploring Monterey Bay. We're on KSQD, and I am Matilda Rand, and my guest is Margaret Kahn in her books, but we know her as Margie. We consider her our friend of radio, and she's very interested in radio and has actually done radio herself. Isn't that correct?
It's true. It's great to be on radio here, and I don't have to run the board. Thank you, Damien.
And so she's been reading from Familiar Strangers, stories from America and the Middle East, and we'll hear 2 more stories later. So far we talked about how she became friends with some and in contact with people from the Middle East. She lived in Iran, was studying there, doing her dissertation, right?
Yeah, I was doing my research and teaching.
And teaching
And volunteering in the refugee schools, just kind of being there, yeah.
Yeah. And then she also lived in Egypt. And that's why she can tell all these stories, which are sparked by some of the people she met. And the interesting thing that I thought was that the first book that she wrote was The Children of the Jinn, which is In Search of the Kurds in that country, which was a memoir. Right now, I'm going to ask her, what's the purpose of this book?
I wanted the stories to be out there. They were published, most of them. One of them was the basis. Familiar Strangers was a play that was up in Silicon Valley in 2012. It was based on that story. So I wanted them to be out there. They're historical now, in a way, because the Middle East has changed so much since I lived there. And I thought these cultures were so amazing, especially Persian culture. We have an unacknowledged debt to Persian culture here in the West, that it came in through Muslim Spain. When Europe was in the Dark Ages, the Middle East was very advanced by comparison, and many of the things that we take for granted came originally from there. And there is no acknowledgement of that in our culture. And these 2 proselytizing religions, Christianity and Islam, have gone head to head, which is pretty terrible.
Yeah.
And I wanted them to be out there for Americans to my understanding, which I spent all of my adult life learning the languages and learning more about the culture and history.
You want to talk about people from different cultures that meet, and then you're not talking from your own point of view. What's the advantage of not talking from your own point of view?
Well, to try to understand the other and to present it to people from another point of view. The story that I'm going to read next, it is from the point of view of an American who was there in the Peace Corps in Iran. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. And I think some people think only people from a particular culture could write about that culture. But I think sometimes you have perceptions or awareness that people from that culture might not have. So
I understand that you want to understand why people make certain decisions. And the fiction that you write helps you to get deeper into what might be the reasons why people make these decisions. You told me about the first story that you sent to an Armenian editor, and her response was?
Understanding the enemy. I did send that to an editor. She said it's an amazing story. It's like the story she would have written about her own mother. So she couldn't publish it. It's a rave rejection. All fiction writers know about rave rejections. Yeah, I felt really good getting that from her, not being Armenian myself.
Do you think when you write about different cultures in your stories, is that more complicated?
Oh, totally. I've just taken on something that's so hard. I saw that with the play, because you have people on stage and you have to explain some things because people can't just grasp it the way they would if you had a play that was set in Santa Cruz, right? Or it was set in Los Angeles, but it was in this Iranian family. It makes it a lot harder.
Yeah.
It does.
Well, let's hear another excerpt from your book.
Okay, well, this is from the point of view of an American. And I wrote this story because while I was in Iran, I heard the outlines of a story of a Peace Corps volunteer who had been kicked out of Iran because he insulted the Shah's mother-in-law. And I was also very interested in the way Iranians celebrate Moharram, the 10th day of Moharram, which is their period of mourning. It's kind of like the old Christian practices leading up to the crucifixion, very similar. And he gets caught up in that towards the end. But here's the part where he's about to go to the village on his motorcycle where he's working, and before the big disaster happens. The February air entered his nostrils like a sharp herb as he kicked down the pedal of his motorcycle and headed out of town along the avenue of plane trees. Amir hung on behind as they sped past the fallow fields of winter. Matt noticed once again how the sun made this ancient used-up land so full of erosion and cracks seem fascinating. He loved the weather here. 1 or 2 brief thunderstorms were the only breaks in a series of days that were framed in turquoise and azure. Amir hopped off before they came within sight of the village. Matt had been here long enough to understand what was going on. If Matt were seen transporting a mere student like Amir, he might lose face. If Amir showed up with his teacher, he might attract too much envy from his peers. Matt got off his motorcycle alone. There were more people hanging about than usual. Children with dirt-streaked faces crowded around the motorcycle. It never got old. The arrival of the Peace Corps volunteer to their village was like the arrival of the afternoon bus. It gave them something to mark their days, something to look forward to. He smiled and waved the way he always did, and then he walked to the house of the village headman. The men stood when he entered. The villagers had gaunt, sunburnt faces and rusty black suits. The city men had paler skin and European worsted over thicker waists. After everyone sat down, the headman's daughter set a glass of tea on the rug in front of him. "Thank you," he said, the words sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. After the ritual greetings, no one said anything, but Matt could see from the way their eyes met, past him, over him, around him, that before he came they'd had plenty to talk about. Matt kept stealing glances at his watch. Already these visitors were over 2 hours late. They were coming from Tabriz to the north. It was part of a tour, a jaunt through the unwashed countryside. The royals, in the person of the Shah's mother-in-law, were engineering a series of photo ops to show Americans and the rest of the world how much they were helping poor villagers. This was part of the Shah's so-called White Revolution, where not only was the land supposed to be redistributed, the serfs were supposed to be re-educated. They might believe this in Washington, but Matt knew better.
Wow.
So I think I'll stop there, but it
gets pretty complicated.
Well, yeah, he insults the Shah's mother-in-law, but he insults her by not, I won't say how, but
people can read it in the book.
Yeah, and on his way out of Iran, he joins these incredible demonstrations in Tehran. So I kind of linked the two. That was the imaginative part. Right. I think a lot of times in fiction it's like that. You have a sort of kernel of truth, and then you have something else you want to talk about, and it sort of is an alchemy.
So that brings me to the question, how often do you think people from one culture meets people from another culture and unknowingly, unwittingly make a terrible mistake?
That's what my book, Joan of the Gin, is about.
Perfect.
I wrote about so many mistakes in that book, and I was determined to do that. People just couldn't understand how I could do that. They would not have done that. But I wanted to do that.
A quick question before I have you read another piece. How did you establish friendships with people from the Middle Eastern cultures? And how is that reflected in your book?
Learning the language really helped. I mean, really. That's what I was there with the Kurds doing. They didn't even speak Farsi, a lot of those women. I just spoke to them in Kurdish. And I spent a lot of time working on the language to have that facility. But there's also nonverbal communication. I've done that too. I don't know. You find the commonality in humanity, right?
Yep.
And you have the desire.
Let's hear a little bit from the other story that you brought to us.
Okay, this is about a guy who, after a long time in California, he's a Kurd and another academic, he came back to Iranian Kurdistan during the uprising of the Kurds in Iraq. And he came in and stood among them. A memory of being a small child pressed against the skirts of the women came back to him. He and his mother had stepped out of the sunlight into a small room filled with women, a wedding perhaps or a funeral. The room felt dark after all that sun, darker still when she let go of his hand. He was so short he couldn't see their faces and no longer knew which of the women was her. At first he had wanted to cry out. Only the fear of being shamed had stopped him. But after a moment he had caught his breath and smelled their female smell and been comforted by the rustling of all those yards and yards of gathered fabric. A sudden irrational urge to kneel down came over him, to go and clasp his hands around someone's skirt and bury his face in the warm folds. Instead, he stepped back, away from them, conscious of how strange he must look. He had not shaved his beard before leaving California, but only trimmed it. Here men wore beards to show piety to Islam. He looked down at his legs and thought how thin and pitiful they must appear. The men here wore shalwar, which are almost as generous with folds as the women's costumes. But he had to stop thinking about how different he looked. It didn't matter how far away you took a plant from the land where it had first taken root and grown. It was still the same plant.
Well, we don't have much time, but I want to let people know that you'll be listening to Margaret Kahn. She read from her book, Familiar Strangers, Stories from America and the Middle East. And there's a lot more in that book. She's also done articles on phonetics and phonology, and they have appeared in academic journals. And her short stories have been published in literary journals and popular magazines. And of course, she has some plays that were performed in California and Maryland. Her website is Pearl Note Press, PearlNote Press.com, pearlnotepress.com. I love the cover. The cover was designed by Linda Rindle.
Yeah, Linda Rindle, yes, my neighbor.
Your neighbor, perfect. Yeah. You know how to choose places to get experiences in Iran and Egypt and wherever else you've lived. And of course, you choose fantastic neighbors. So I really enjoyed my conversation with you. Is there anything else that you would like to say at this point?
I'm so glad to be in Monterey, and I'm so glad to be on Matilda's program, and thank you, Damien. Thank you, listening audience.
Again, this was Exploring Monterey Bay with Monterey Bay author Margaret Kahn. Familiar Strangers, Stories from America and the Middle East. See you next time.